A video game company that needs no introduction, but I'll give them one anyway, is Capcom. Best known for legendary franchises like Mega Man, Final Fight, and of course Resident Evil, they are perhaps best well known for making the fighting game genre what it is today. Back in the 90s though, there were dozens of button bashers vying for your quarters and attention, and not just dominated by 3 or 4 big ones, making it a rather wild time for the genre. Someone that's trying to harken back to those days a little bit, however, is Rare Breed Makes Games and Axis Games, who have just come out swinging with Blazing Strike, a brand new 2D fighter that's about to KO Steam, PS4, PS5, and the Nintendo Switch. Featuring giant old-school sprites, deep yet simple to understand mechanics, and a crazy roster of characters, Blazing Strike has an old-school presentation but with modern touches, like rollback power netcode and a lore-rich story mode. During intense bouts against either the CPU or a friend, use the versatile rush mechanic to open your opponent up or opt for a more defensive strategy with parries or to disrupt your opponent's combos. One modern staple that Blazing Strike will not be adopting, however, is paid DLC, as the game will eventually be offering 2 post-launch characters that will be 100% free. If that sounds good to you, and I don't know why it wouldn't, rush on over to the links in the description or pinned comment below to square off with Blazing Strike. Thanks again to Rare Breed and Access for sponsoring today's video, and without further ado, let's commence the operation. Hello and welcome to another episode of What Happened, where we are marathoning through the development stories of 4 different horror and horror-adjacent video games. And with that in mind, there are very few titles that fit that horror-adjacent descriptor better than today's subject. A subject that really encapsulated Capcom's 2010s obsession with pulling their flagship franchise Resident Evil away from its survival horror roots. Of course, I've tackled the 6th mainline entry before, which while commercially successful when it released in 2012, didn't quite hit the critical goals Capcom were expecting. A trend that was foreshadowed earlier that same year with a spin-off that didn't quite spin off. So get your best gas mask, sidearm, and cool call sign as I answer the question, what happened to Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City?
More zombies.
For this episode, I went straight to the source as I possibly could, a former senior staff member who worked on Operation Raccoon City and who has graciously gave me some of their time to talk about this divisive entry in RE's legacy. But to kick this off right, we're going to need to put ourselves in the futuristic time period known as 2010, where Resident Evil 6 was shaping up to be an expensive, loud, and a supremely bloated experience. To sort of capitalize on all that hype, but not overshadow it too much, Capcom wanted to put out a smaller scale companion game to release roughly in the same time frame, and we're looking to collaborate with outside Western third parties to do it. My source stated that the relationship between Capcom and Vancouver-based Slant 6 started when an agency just so happened to put them together, and they immediately started the pitching process for said Resident Evil project. In very typical What Happened fashion though, this started off as something quite different from what we eventually got, in that Slant 6 were pushing for a full-on remake of Resident Evil 2. Their pitch was to reframe the final hours of Raccoon City through more of a RE4 style lens, over-the-shoulder camera, more emphasis on action, modern graphics, etc. Reportedly, Capcom rebuffed this, as they themselves were considering a remake of RE2 at that time, but it would be quite a while before they would make good on that. So instead, they suggested using RE2 merely as the backdrop, but focus even more on all-out action and co-op, and it's here where Slant 6 honed in on a scenario and particular style of gameplay that would get things moving. To an extent, the original concept came from creative director Adam Bullied, supported by the design team and specifically our in-house Resident Evil expert Andrew Lee. We all liked Resident Evil, but for Andrew, it was like scripture. Adam described the concept and influence as similar to Rosencrantz or Guildenstern Are Dead, where two minor characters from Hamlet have the story play out from their point of view. In reality, the pitching process stopped when three-corner combat became a pillar of the project. Humans versus humans with bioweapons and zombies in between. This concept excited everyone. Slant 6 was tasked with providing it through a demo. Success meant we were greenlit. Failure meant I'd be out of a job, along with everyone else. It was quite high stakes. This demo went down well in internal reviews, as the warring factions concept, my source confirmed, was something Capcom was all about, as they were specifically looking to attract a more mainstream Call of Duty audience to hopefully hop on the crazy biohazardous world of Resident Evil. So while this wasn't exactly what some on the Slant 6 side originally had wanted to push forward with, when a publisher of a giant legendary billion-dollar franchise is happy with what you are doing, you tend to just sort of go with the flow. Before we push on ahead though, I do think we should rewind back just a little bit more, so bear with me here. As I've covered before, back in the mid-2000s, LucasArts had scrapped Star Wars Battlefront 3 for some reason, which had been under development by Free Radical Entertainment and was a cancellation that was something of a death blow for the studio. Why is this relevant? Well, after an attempt by Rebellion to salvage that project, LucasArts took the final swipe of its lightsaber and killed it completely. This process then restarted and ended the exact same way a few years later, when the house that George sort of built contracted Slant 6 to make an all-new version of Battlefront 3, and then just canceled it all over again. This is evidenced by the fact that in 2012, images of this version of BF3 were found on the final rework disc, which obviously sparked discussion about another hitherto unknown cancelled Star Wars title. Regardless of the reasoning behind this cancellation, it put Slant 6 in a situation much like the one Free Radical found itself in earlier. When something you're cooking on the back burner gets ruined, it means all the pressure is now placed upon your main dish, and that pressure would certainly rise with the constantly changing scope and ticking countdown timer Slant 6 would have to work against to complete Operation Raccoon City. Of course, it wouldn't be a good old episode of What Happened without some hugely inconvenient technical hurdles, so try to be shocked when I tell you this had some. Slant 6 had made several SOCOM games in the past, and were right in the middle of doing a complete overhaul of the tech they used there to make the engine to power reorg. This meant they had to design and program the demo, get the green light, immediately launch in the development of the full-fledged game, all while still trying to finalize the engine that it ran on, a tall order for any studio. In addition to that, much of the pre-design work Slant 6 had done during the demo phase didn't really match up with what Capcom had wanted for the full game in terms of story, which was a whole other issue in and of itself. A lot of snap decisions had to be made, and working with a Japanese company proved tricky, as we found that if someone floated an idea, it could quickly be embraced and become a milestone or feature. For example, someone, not me, decided that the story should be recorded in January, despite the game being greenlit in October. So, in the first quarter, the script recordings began. This was an incredibly short deadline, especially considering that, at the time, we were still struggling to complete our first level. Inafune-san's departure, in my view, significantly impacted the project. He was a supporter of external development and embraced innovation. After a demo of some upcoming gameplay, he once said, "Slant 6 understands Resident Evil." After he left, I felt some aspects of the project became less flexible and a bit more strained. This isn't the first time that the practices Inafune had put into place in previous years, like collaborating with Western developers, then didn't deeply affect several in-development projects when he abruptly left. When that happened, the remaining Capcom executives started to grow wary of collaboration in the wake of such perceived failures as Bionic Commando, Dark Void, and Spyborg, so this left teams, like those working on Lost Planet 3 and Reorg, holding the bag. One such instance where Capcom and Slant 6 differing design philosophies came into play was with the tried and true headshot mechanic. Slant 6 initially approached it from a Western shooter perspective, where headshots would function as expected: aim, fire, and pop. However, Capcom had a different vision, which made it into the game's first playable public appearance, which I believe was at Captivate 2011. The reduced lethality of the headshot led to some negative feedback from critics and outlets, and seemed to persist all the way until it launched the next year, although I believe a post-launch patch did rectify this, but it's hard to confirm that nowadays. Complications due to developing the engine, spending a lot of time going back and forth with Capcom, and the very quick turnaround time, about a year and some change, meant that the reorg team had to dial back a lot of the ambition they had designed. We originally planned to have a cover system where you could leap over obstacles, but that feature was scrapped. The dynamic cover system we had at the prototype stage was pretty cool, as the character would ease in and out of cover, reacting to the environment, like a Special Forces soldier trying to stay as concealed as possible. A lot of co-op moments, I'd say most, were cut, along with certain story scenarios. For example, the Super Tyrant was meant to have co-op gameplay where he'd be hanging on the elevator, and players would need to target both his hands at the same time to defeat him. We also had ideas for climbing co-op moments like grab my hand mechanics, breaching, and the demo class being able to blow alternative routes through levels with explosives. Flashlights, they are interestingly in this CG animated promo, however, they're not in the game for tech reasons. And oh, there is a reason City Hall was so big, it was meant to have a boss inside. Originally, Wesker was going to be featured in the game with a Super Wesker moment involving an injection, but that got cut as well. One feature that wasn't cut but was heavily scaled down was the Nemesis mode that shipped with the Xbox version, I think contractually. In the prototype, players could battle for control of Nemesis and actually control him, but this was cut. I believe Capcom wanted to save that concept for something else. But here's the biggest kicker of them all, and that was the length of the story campaign, or more specifically, the lack of length, a subject I'm very familiar with. On a very casual playthrough, most players could beat the single player mode in around 6 hours, 4 if they really rushed. That wasn't Slant 6's original plan though, as they initially were going to create 2 distinct story campaigns so you could see the scenario play out between both the Umbrella Forces and the Spec Ops / Echo 6 team. Players would have been able to choose which one to start with, and completing a mission would unlock the next in the other campaign, along with a whole other tier of bonus missions on top of that. But much like a lot of the stuff we've just covered, it came down to a matter of unrealized potential clashing with an unrealistic timeline, and sadly it was Slant 6 that would be the ultimate casualty of that battle. Slant 6 and Capcom would continually go back and forth on certain elements up until launch, which included the aforementioned issues regarding the game's story. It was Capcom's idea to de-canonize the game, once the whole Kill Leon aspect was added in, which was more of a marketing ploy than anything else. The anonymous staffer also outlined the process Capcom took for the story and dialogue before it was integrated into the game. They were very hands-on. For example, I mentioned the deadline with the script. Once they received it, they took it in-house, reworked it, and then delivered it back. We were only allowed to make a few improvements. I remember some Western press criticizing Slant for the story, not knowing that it was ultimately written in-house. With all these issues, you should then not be too surprised that a familiar creature, one even more deadly than a hunter or as devastating as a tyrant, would eventually enter the fray. And that was, of course, the ferocious and hope-crushing Crunch Monster. My source stated that in the first 6 months of 2011, they only got 9 days off, spending many weekends in the office along with several other core team members. Unfortunately, all that hard work didn't really pay off in the very end. When it launched in March of 2012, it was to a fairly negative critical response. Many found the main story campaign repetitive and lacking excitement, while consistent issues with bugs and online matchmaking being particular sticking points. A lot of these were eventually improved with patches, but some of you may recall here that addressing bugs and oversights like these took a lot longer back then than they do today, so it wasn't until June for them to finally be ironed out. Commercially though, Reorc did quite well the world over, which I guess is a testament to the game's more mainstream appeal, as it became the second best-selling game in North America that month, below only to the mighty Mass Effect 3. My source said they were directly told the game had cleared over 2 million copies in its first few weeks on sale, whereupon Slant 6 was also apparently told that a follow-up game would be on the table if they hit those sales targets. Somewhat predictably, this didn't exactly come to pass. We pitched several ideas. One of them was actually being moved forward, but I guess that's still under NDA. Another idea was to create a hybrid action horror game, a cross between Resident Evil and Uncharted, with Wesker as the main protagonist. The story would explore his divergence from Umbrella as he begins to realize that his research is being used in ways that differ from his original vision, a personal war between him and Umbrella. Now, I know this may sound like heresy to a few of you RE hardcores out there, but personally, Uncharted Wesker's Fortune or like Wesker May Cry sounds like some bomb-ass shit. Unfortunately, though, we don't live in that timeline. The former staff member explained that despite Reorc's very strong sales, its less than ideal critical reception affected their relationships with other publishers, and it made pitching future projects quite difficult. So, after 3 mobile games that, I'm just gonna be honest here, I've never heard of, Slant 6 were essentially forced to close their doors in 2013, despite Reorc's commercial success. To this day, Capcom has attempted several times to try and offer some type of multiplayer-heavy online Resident Evil shooter thing, and at this point, I'm starting to think this ambition has just been thwarted again and again by like a bio curse or something, and it just sucks that a passionate studio was taken down along with it. As for the former Slant 6 staffer, well, they don't view the experience completely negatively, saying that, despite Capcom taking the game in a direction that the team didn't fully agree with, there were still rewarding moments. For instance, dreaming up the narrative of how the dead soldiers and tyrants you encounter in Resident Evil 3 meant their fate was incredibly satisfying. Orc provided the backstory for those events, filling in gaps that fans had long wondered about. Remains to be seen if Capcom will ever revisit this sort of premise, but you never know. One day, they're just gonna put more RE characters into Dead by Daylight, who am I kidding? A big thanks goes out to the former staff member who was so forthcoming for today's episode. And if you out there know of any other biohazardous befuddlements in the video game or movie industries, do let me know in the comments below, or take an elevator into the secret laboratory that is my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching!